Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining Solving Retail's Most Expensive Problem, Digging Yourself Out from Under the Returns Avalanche with Navjit, Bhasin, CEO of Newmine, and Michael Relich, Interim CEO of PacSun Eddie Bauer. As a reminder, if you have any questions, please submit them using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Now here's your host, Deborah Weinswig, CEO and founder of Coresight Research.
Thank you, Drew, and thank you all for joining me today. I am honored to be here with returns expert, who many of you know, and CEO of Newmine, Navjit Bhasin, and Newmine advisor and a dear friend of mine, Mike Relich, who's also, as Drew said, the interim CEO of PacSun Eddie Bauer. Mike brings a wealth of experience to all of us, over 30 years of retail operations and systems experience to the conversation. He served in various COO roles for iconic brands like Lucky Brand, Crate & Barrel, and Guess. He also has served as a CIO for Guess. So, as we're all kind of taking a pause and, kind of thinking about, the holiday season, and many of us are planning for back to school 21 and holiday 21, retailers are facing an unprecedented return season for many reasons, right? Fueled by the historic rates of e-commerce holiday sales in 20, which then in turn led to an increase in web purchase returns. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to kind of deep dive with Navjit and Mike on actionable ways retailers in the audience today can cope with the onslaught of returns and some of the associated operational challenges, right? Reverse logistics, continues to be a challenge. I mean, logistics in general, but certainly when things are going the other direction. And, kind of what can everyone do to prepare for the future and start reducing returns overall? So really I've highlighted 3 things we want you to get out of the conversation today. So number 1, how to overcome operational challenges, such as a breakdown in supply chain efficiencies, during a return surge. Number 2, navigating the return solution ecosystem and really kind of diagnose your needs. And then number 3, actionable steps to catch up in your returns backlog, which I think talking to folks, many of you are kind of handling with, right now. So Mike and Navjit, let's, kind of rewind a little bit. This holiday season was certainly different than one that I think any of us have experienced before. Can you kind of break down what that looked like? And it was certainly earlier. Were there specific trends you saw within physical store returns or versus e-commerce? I'll hand it over to you two to discuss.
Okay. Deborah, go ahead, Mike.
Go ahead, Navjit. It's fine.
Well, Deborah, first of all, thanks for having me on this webinar. Excited to be here as always with you. And Deborah, I think, just because as we all saw in the COVID, right, e-com was accelerated. And September was when the consumer confidence really started coming back a bit. And then the early shopping season, and some of the credit goes to Coresight for, putting in 10-10. And I think that's when the season started picking up. But what happened was, in fact, believe it or not, even today, some of our customers are seeing returns come back from November and October.
To echo Navjit, basically when the carriers came in and started putting surcharges in, and those surcharges all hit on Black Friday week. So we work with our merchants and marketing departments, and we had a strategy to say, let's pull as many sales forward, because our e-com penetration went from, in PacSun from 20% to almost 50%. So huge increases. And so we tried to push as many sales forward. But what happened is, returns on things like, knits or, my fleece, that the fit's not really a problem. We didn't see huge increases there. But categories like denim, where, most people go to a store and it's, fit is very important. There we saw actually big increases in returns. And, to your point, the reverse logistics were a problem. We have a system that the customer goes in, they print out a label and they send it back. Well, the problem is we had delays in shipping for the DC to get those goods. They were busy trying to fulfill orders, and of course, returns are going to be last result. And so the customer noise on social media and just the call center volumes went way up. So we scrambled and implemented a solution where, hey, look, if we know that you dropped it off at FedEx and we got your tracking number, then we're just going to credit you. And if you abuse the system, we'll turn you off. But we ended up having to go and rush and do that just to make sure that we could keep customers happy and not impact lifetime value.
So Mike, to kind of elaborate on that, were there as you think about kind of just the timing of returns, how did it differ from, previous years? And, what did you find surprising?
Well, what's interesting is that because the season started early, returns started earlier. But then to Navjit's point, when people that bought gifts, we're seeing returns come even later. And then the problem is normally we try to push people to return in the store. I mean, that's the whole brick and mortar people say is dead, but come on, let's leverage it. And if somebody wants to return something, return something to a DC, I'm not going to get a follow-on sale. But if you return something to a store and my associates are worth half their salt, they'll go and sell and do an upsell or save the sale. But the problem is with COVID, people were very reluctant to go to the stores. So we saw a surge in DC returns, much higher than we've seen in the past.
Well, if I may add, Deborah, there was another thing that was happening, right? So since now returns were delayed, earlier, the way the planning was working or used to work was you could anticipate returns. They're going to hit back in my DC within 7 days, and within 3 days, I can either, refurbish if it is still first quality, put it back on sale. But now, the later the returns come, you lose that opportunity to either resell it or it goes into further markdown. Again, hitting the bottom line badly.
Navjit, that's a very, very important point. Because if I look at Eddie Bauer, where outerwear is a huge component of our sales. Basically, if that gets returned and we miss the season, it ends up getting marked down or basically saved for the next season. So it's a huge profitability impact.
But there's also the other impact, right, which I think both of you bring up, which is, right, in many cases they're retailers were very tight on inventory. There was demand for product, and if it was sitting in some DC, right, and the consumer couldn't get access to it, I mean, it was kind of the worst of all worlds. And I think this goes back to, right, some of the challenges around returns, which many of us have we've never seen anything, kind of quite like this thing in terms of like the volume of returns and just how important it was for the consumer to have access to that product. And I think that, we saw, I mean, I don't know about you guys, I was very surprised by how strong sales were in November and December, right? Like up 8.3%. How did that kind of, vary versus expectations? And if sales weren't expected to be that strong, how is that also impacting returns, Mike?
I mean, returns are definitely way up because sales are up. People are buying on e-com. They can't try it on, and a lot of people, they'll buy a small and a medium, try them both, and then end up returning one. So that was a huge impact. And then the problem is we had a DC that was responding to 100% increase in e-com, and that's the priority. We have returns building up, and to your point. I was pushing them and trying to put more labor. Look, get that inventory back into sellable status, because the last thing I want to do is be stuck with a bunch of unseasonable inventory that we have to mark down in the end. So it was kind of a push and pull. I mean, we really had to prioritize. Some days I would tell the staff, look, go throw a crew on returns and get those processed, because one, the customers are actually getting irritated by it not getting processed, but two, just having access to that inventory. Because to your point, we were turning faster than we've turned in a long time, just because of the light inventory.
Well, and Deborah, if I may add to that, right? So, and we've talked about it previously as well. Customers obviously are not happy, but at the same point in time, the delays that are happening and not having good insights into it definitely causes bigger issues. And where I'm going with that is, returns has always been an afterthought. And that's what, our mission at Newmine is. How do we become returns to the table as part of the conversation when sales are starting to happen versus, hey, we'll figure it out once it happens. And that's when, this whole situation of returns avalanche that we are in today.
Yeah,
it's an excellent point. I mean, Mike, how are you saying that?
No, I mean, I always look at returns as, I refer to it as taking out the garbage. It's something that people don't like to do, and they kind of
or talk about.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that, you know, the thing is people really don't plan for it. And our planners are doing the same thing. They were planning, you know, for gross sales, and yet we have this huge return liability. And what would end up happening is, especially with outerwear, come February and March, we'd end up with all this excess inventory. So, you know, now we've changed the planning cycle to say, look, plan for those returns, and then let's staff the DC to make sure that when they come in, we can process them, get the goods back in inventory, and liquidate that merchandise before the end of the season. So, and you know, by doing this, we've actually increased gross margins, so it's been effective.
But isn't that so hard? I mean, I remember as an analyst, right, talking to, right, like, chief merchandising officers, and they're like, it's so hard, right? Because, buyers have a passion for the product, right? The fact that you're not getting 100% sell-through, right, continues to amaze them, let alone factoring in any kind of return rate. How do you, there's a whole education process there, Mike.
Well, there's a huge education process. And to your point, nobody really wants to deal with it. And then the other problem is it's kind of opaque, because everybody looks at returns as, oh yeah, our return rate is, maybe 18%, I'm making up that number. And nobody looks and say, well, what's the return rate by category? And, look, I look at a business like PacSun, where a third of it's branded goods, a third of it's private label, and a third is market goods. And do we think we have standard blocks between those? No, we don't. And so, as a medium across every one of those vendors? Not really. So do we really know what's driving returns, what categories, and how can we adjust for that? And, nobody really thinks about that. They just think about gross numbers at the top. And like with retail, the devil's in the detail.
Oh, Deborah, in fact, you just brought up 2 points. One is, when you started talking about the merchants, right? The merchants are, obviously for the right reason, their emotion, how they want their product to be characterized and sold. So there's that, internal emotion as well, which, if you combine that emotion with real data insights, I think that's where the real excellence is, in my opinion, right? And then secondly, just yesterday, I was talking to a few retail executives, and point, Mike, that you just brought up about the plan, every retailer puts in their plan, hey, I'm going to be planning 20% returns, right? So as long as it's within the plan, nobody cares about it, or nobody wants to take proactive action, right? But I think it's time where even that plan needs to be relooked at, how everybody relooked at how industry changed in COVID.
Oh, no, I'll just say, in a world where everyone's striving for comp sales increases, the easiest way to, instead of me paying digital marketing huge sums of money to drive traffic, it's easier if I could reduce returns by 1%. That's a 1% increase in comp sales. And to me, that's low-hanging fruit that people ignore.
It really is almost getting back to the basics, but at the same time, and I know we've talked about this, but since ultimately, right, if you think about how everyone's incented, kind of returns are, in a class of their own with regards to opportunity, which is, I think, why this conversation is so valuable. But also, kind of looking at different, insights around those, and for, to understand consumer behavior, but also for them to never happen in Navjit. I think, I always bring up, sustainability is, kind of core to Coresight. And we have this conversation. How do we have the return, kind of never take place in the first place, Navjit?
Deborah, you're stealing Newmine's tagline. The best return is the one that never has to happen, right? And I'll give you a stat. So just this year alone, even the product reviews we've seen go up by about 33%, which means consumers know that, hey, e-commerce is here to stay. And they were trying to also find ways, hey, how do I interact more with back to the brand and the retailer? And that's the reason you saw the product reviews go up. Now, that is where, some of the low-hanging fruit, the low-hanging opportunities are, which a retailer can take action and right away. But again, when you're carrying hundreds of active products, hundreds of customers trying to talk back to you, humanly, it's impossible to chase it. And that's why, how do you automate those insights? How do you bring those actionable insights to the table of a merchant, a buyer who can actually take an action in near real time? Because you cannot change the past. At least based on the immediate past, how do you control your future?
in a very similar way. I think, it's like with any problem, if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. And to Navjit's point, most retailers, I mean, if you look at it, everyone's looking at comp sales. And if I've got 20% comps today, okay, I've won. And then, we put a reserve on the books for returns, and that gets put below the line. So it's really not that visible. And people are incented by comp sales. So I think that, you have to make it in the organization, you have to make it a priority, and you have to start measuring people on it, because like anything, if you don't measure people on a specific metric, it'll never improve.
No, I think that's, I just want to fold in, we have a question that came in from Tim. Thank you. Are companies using analytics to identify different levels of returns by consumer? Mike brought up, kind of some categories, which is very real.
One of the things that we are trying to, that we're actually working on right now is, we're putting the customer data platform together, aggregating, data on customers, trying to, put an identity management there to make sure that we know exactly who this customer is across all channels and calculate lifetime value. And so one of the ideas here is, if a customer is a chronic returner and is a low lifetime value, well, you know what, when they call up the call center, I'll probably accommodate them less than I would a high value customer. One of the other things is, when we look at the DC and we look at fulfillment, when we're backed up, how do I prioritize fulfillment? Today, I do it first in, first out. But why wouldn't I want to do that based on lifetime value of the customer? And if, take the best customers, make sure that they go to the front of the queue. Then take my new customers and put them in so they have a great experience. And the guys that aren't profitable, put them at the end of the queue, because, if I have to degrade my service for anybody, I might as well do that for the person who's the lower lifetime value and, the chronic returner.
I think this answers Tim's question, but I think it's a really, kind of important one. Navjit, I mean, you're all about data and analytics. How do you think this, kind of changes not only the customer journey, but the retailer's journey as well?
So Deborah, one of the things which we brought to market is what we call Keep Score. And it's not just about the customer. Absolutely, customer is very important. But if you look at the customer under the lens of Keep Score, combine it with the vendor or the supplier, and combine it with the product or the hierarchy as well, right? I mean, that can automatically give you, how Mike was explaining, hey, who's my top performers, my lowest performers, but looking at it under a net, I should say, an algorithm, which takes into consideration returns as well. Because it's not just a simple transaction, right? You got to understand the total big picture and how profitable is this customer, or how are even my vendors performing in this particular product category. And think of Keep Score as similar to what credit score is for the financial industry. I mean, financial industry uses that metric to make a lot of decisions about an individual. And for us, Keep Score has 5 different dimensions. Because Mike, not only the product, the consumer, suppliers are important, but even locations. Hey, where did the demand come from? Where did I fulfill it from? And where did it get returned to? Too many variables for somebody to work on it using just reports. It just doesn't cut it.
Yeah, that's really critical. And I think we have a poll that we're about to launch. And between Newmine and Coresight, I think we've got a few bottles of wine for those of you who answered the poll, and some other swag. So please hop in, and we'll kind of disclose the results in a few minutes. We have a question from Michael, and he says, good point. On regarding having a better turnaround on returns through stores in a DC. With that said, any insight on how you can improve when it's going through the DC? His whole thing is it's, kind of probably takes 2 to 3 weeks before product goes back to, kind of sellable status.
Yeah, I mean, basically we use a system where, customers go in and they actually initiate the return. So with that, we can kind of forecast exactly when the returns are going to hit the DC. And then we use that to help schedule the staff. So, in the past, a trailer would show up, we're like, oh, okay, where did this come from? And we were caught flat-footed. Now, basically, I know exactly when customers initiate a return. I know, that they dropped it off at FedEx and what the tracking is. And it's really to go and make sure that you align the labor in the DC to accommodate the load. So it's like anything. If you can plan the volumes, you can deal with it much quicker. So that's really how we're trying to improve it.
Well, Michael, I'll actually extend that as well, because see, that addresses the immediate operational challenges. Now, just think of that, right? When a consumer initiates a return, and by the time that return hits your dock or gets into your, let's say, warehouse management or order management system, there is a delay of 5 to 7 days. But if right at the point when the initiation happens of the return, and if we could gain insights as to why is he returning, there is an opportunity to tackle and make other changes which can impact in-season return reduction.
Well, no, absolutely, Navjit, because I think when it goes back to your early comment, the best return is no return. And a lot of people, and I know this from a prior job, I had a big initiative that I was spearheading to try to reduce returns. And actually, I put in Chief Returns Officer as part of that initiative. And the thing is everyone thought, oh, well, it's not going to have an impact because we find that we have a fit problem. By the time we fix it and then we order for the next season, it'll be a year later. And I said, no, that's not true. Because if we could forecast, if we see at an item level that an item has a high return level, and we look at the customer comments and see that basically, look, it's because it's running too small, we can adjust the copy immediately and actually inform customers that, this is a great item, but it happens to run small or it happens to run big. And then basically we can nip that problem in the bud. So I think that, analytics are critical here. And, the thing that I really liked about Chief Returns Officer was that basically not only could I go and get a forecast early on that an item was going to have a high return rate, but we could combine that with social media and reviews and see, well, what was driving that return? Was it quality? Was it fit? And if we knew the core problem, we could actually adjust the copy and mitigate those issues.
We've got quite a few questions coming in. I have a few folks who've raised their hand. So I'm going to turn it over to Jen Kuzara to ask her question. Okay, we've got many coming in as well. So let's kind of return to the queue. How does kind of one incentivize customers to keep versus return?
That's a really interesting question. I know that when people look at Amazon and Walmart, who a lot of times they'll just tell you to keep it, and I think that works with large goods, hard goods, that probably the cost of processing the return probably exceeds the gross margin. But for a huge company like that, they can absorb that. For someone in the apparel space, I think it's more difficult. But one of the things that we've toyed with is, look, do we offer bounce back coupons or future discounts if people keep the items, et cetera. But that's something that we haven't implemented, but it's a topic that we've been discussing.
Well, and Deborah, the reason companies like Walmart, Amazon are able to do it, obviously they have deeper pockets, but they really have access to smart intelligence at their fingertips when they're interacting with that consumer. It makes a big difference, right?
Good point. It's an excellent point. All right, we've got a question from Matt. It's a great one. Navjit, can we hear more about the 5 components or dimensions of the customer score? And he also says, thank you, by the way, this is a helpful conversation.
I'm glad you found it helpful. So the 5 dimensions that are in place are the consumer, the product itself, vendor, hierarchy, and the location. And we're just starting. So again, as our product evolves, as we onboard more customers, we're absolutely going to be adding more dimensions to it. And just think of it this way, right? 5 to the power of 5. And tomorrow we have another 6 dimension, 6 to the power of 6. And that's where, our goal is to make retail smarter and smarter and smarter. Because humanly, it's impossible to chase all of those issues.
That's an important point. All right, another question around And this is something Mike and Navjit, we've talked about, kind of what about sizing recommendation tools to help limit returns due to wrong size? What have you seen and what do you recommend? And, how can people approach this in a different way so the return never happens, as Navjit likes to say?
Well, Mike, I'll go first on this one. So, Deborah, the sizing tools that are out there, they are absolutely helping to reduce return in only in a certain category. And what the surveys and the stats have shown is at least 2/3 of the returns are still under control of the retailer. And that's where deploying a tool like, fit measurement is absolutely a solution. But even before you deploy a solution, you really still need to know the root causes of why it is happening.
Now, I can echo that, Navjit. So we've had a lot of experience with fit tools, and actually we just implemented fit tools both at Eddie Bauer and PacSun. And to your point, it actually does help because these tools look at machine learning and what other purchases people have, and look at tech packs and compare that to an item that you think fits, and it helps mitigate it. But to your point, if I have a vendor who in the manufacturing process basically was out of tolerance, and the fit tool is going to think that the item fits one way, but because of a manufacturing error, it actually fits differently. That's not going to mitigate that problem. And now chief returns officer or the data analytics will actually tell me that specific item has a problem. It's tied to a particular vendor, and it enables us to actually control it and go upstream and figure out what the core problem is. And fitting tools, simply can't do that.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting, the poll data, right? So, let's call it 60% or 2/3 are currently collecting and analyzing returns data. And I think that, to me, the number that really is telling, in terms of how does your organization view returns, basically, almost 40% say it's a significant opportunity, but it goes back to kind of the tools and the solutions and kind of like how to get there. All right, we are coming up. I'll ask two more quick questions. And, this is, one from Jen, who we couldn't have live before, but I appreciate her kind of taking another stab. So are there product imaging software so a customer can see themselves in a product before they purchase? I think this goes along to fit as well, but just this idea of like visualization and, how does that kind of, step into this whole process as well?
We've looked at a number of those visualization technologies, and I think they're in their infancy and they have promise. I've yet to see one that's really, that's really had big success. So I think it's a possibility in the future, especially as processors get processing power, gets more powerful. But the other thing is, to do that, you really have to have the tech pack data. You have to have the actual fit data on that. And for a lot of people who are, let's suppose you're buying branded product, to get access to that tech pack is kind of difficult. So I think we're a ways off there.
Well, and Deborah, I'll give you a very simple example, right? Again, that is a field which will definitely evolve. But even just look at Zoom, right? I have a virtual background, and sometimes if I move, it hasn't reached that level of precision just yet.
That's an excellent point. I mean, there's a lot of this is nuanced, but there's also some pretty significant changes in terms of process, procedure, and ultimately who owns it, right, in an organization, and who can make the decisions and at what time, right? I mean, once again, many of us on the call are already thinking about back to school and holiday, and so this conversation I think is incredibly timely. So we're going to close it out with a question from Brig. This is a very helpful conversation. Brig says Michael's comments around uncovering exactly what was driving the return are spot on. In addition to changing copy, how can, what issues can best be placed into customer support teams promptly, and who are fielding these questions, and maybe, what tools do they have to field these questions?
That's actually a really good question. I think there's a ton of opportunity there now, because right now our call center really has no information on this product. But if we could actually take and if we know there's problems with specific product and make that available to the call center people, I think it could actually go a long way. And what's interesting is we have all that data available. We just haven't actually taken the opportunity to aggregate it and put it into our call center system. But it's funny. I'm doing this webinar here, and actually, that's a really great idea. You just sparked something on me that I'm going to go and pursue.
Hey, Mike, this goes back to the whole holistic 360-degree view of returns. And it's not just for the call center. Obviously, they're at the front line, but everybody in the organization got to have that mindset, looking across the board and being, utilizing it as part of anything that's done in the organization. Because at the end of the day, it's all about profitability. And I'll tell you, in my opinion, for 2021, the retailers got to make sure if they got to make their business more profitable, returns reduction got to be among the top 3 strategic initiatives.
Well, Navjit, I'm going to take a quote from one of my favorites, the CFO at Costco, and he's like, profitability rhymes with sustainability. I'm not sure if they exactly rhyme, but we get his point. And I think that, it's just a great way to think about it. So Navjit and Michael, I don't even think we've touched on half the questions. So we'll have to circle back with everyone. We apologize if we weren't able to get to your question. I think we'll send out answers and also a deck. And please be sure to join us next Wednesday as we discuss with Flo about why it's never been a better time to take your retail business cross-border. Mike and Navjit, thank you so much. And I feel like we've just scratched the surface.
Thank you, Deborah.
Take care. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.